My name is Wrenley Thatch, and I am 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my Uncle Devlin walked into the Deschutes County Clerk's office on the second floor of the old courthouse on Bond Street, holding a quit-claim deed for my grandmother's 7 acres and a forged power of attorney he'd had notarized in Redmond. He thought he was the only person in our family who knew the land was about to change hands. He had no idea that the clerk behind the recording window had been my Sunday school teacher in 2003, that my grandfather had spent the last summer of his life packing a USPS priority mailbox with my name on it, or that I had quietly walked into that same office 21 days earlier and filed a single piece of cream-colored paper that froze every line on his deed before he ever printed it. I'm Wrenley Thatch. I'm 31 years old. I teach kindergarten at Pine Ridge Elementary on the west side of Bend, and last month, on a Tuesday morning at 9:10, my uncle's life ended at a counter window without anyone raising their voice. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to say this. If stories like this find you at the right moment, subscribe. I share a new one every night, quietly, for people who already know what it's like to be the youngest one in the room when something important is being decided. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. There's a woman in Mobile, Alabama who tells me she listens while she folds laundry on Sundays, and I think about her every time I sit down to record. Now let me take you back to the summer I was 9 years old, when my grandfather said something I didn't understand until last month. My grandfather's name was Halston Thatch. Everyone outside the family called him Hal. He worked for 32 years as a land surveyor for Deschutes County, and even after he retired, you could find him most weekday mornings in his workshop behind the house, sharpening pencils with a pocket knife and writing things down in a green ledger book. He was the kind of man who labeled every fuse in the breaker box, who kept his receipts in shoeboxes organized by year going back to 1981, who hand-drew a plat map of his own 7 acres and framed it above the workbench because he said a man should know where his own corners are. He drank his coffee black out of the same chipped Pyrex mug every morning. He wore the same brown Carhartt jacket from October to April. He smelled like sawdust and Old Spice and the cold air that came off the Cascades in the evenings. The summer I was 9, my parents drove me out to the property for the 4th of July. My grandfather took me on what he called the corner walk. We started at the southeast pin and we walked the whole perimeter, all 7 acres, while he pointed out every survey marker like he was introducing me to old friends. I remember the heat coming off the dry grass. I remember the smell of the ponderosa pines. I remember the sound of his boots on the volcanic dirt, that crunch and shift you only hear in Central Oregon. We stopped at the northwest corner, where there was a flat lava rock the size of a card table, and he sat down on it and pulled a butterscotch candy out of his coat pocket and handed it to me. He said, "Land remembers who walked it, kiddo. Paper just helps it remember out loud." I was 9. I unwrapped the candy and I said, "Okay." I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was being a grandfather. The way grandfathers say things that sound like wisdom, but are mostly just the way their voice fits the afternoon. He wrote something in his green ledger that day. I saw him do it. He sat on that rock and he licked the tip of his pencil and he wrote a line, and then he closed the book and we walked back. I never asked what he wrote. I was 9 and there was a slip and slide waiting for me in the side yard. I want to tell you a few more things about him because the rest of this story doesn't make sense unless you understand who he was. My grandfather Hal was the kind of man who kept a coffee can full of pennies on the windowsill above his workbench, sorted by decade, because he said, "Pennies tell you what year was good and what year was hard if you know how to read them." He was the kind of man who would not throw out a manila envelope as long as the metal clasp still worked. He had a label maker from the early 80s, the kind that punched white letters into red plastic tape, and he had labeled the drawers of his tool cabinet. Chisels, planes, files, drill bits, sandpaper grades 60 through 220, and the labels were still on those drawers when I unlocked the workshop 5 years after he died, faded at the edges but readable. He believed in writing things down. He believed in carbon copies. He believed that a thing wasn't real unless somebody had put a pen to a piece of paper about it. My grandmother used to laugh at him. Her name was Frances, and she was the warm one in the marriage, the one who hummed in the kitchen and who made cinnamon rolls every Sunday morning from a recipe she had cut out of a Better Homes and Gardens in 1971. She used to lean against the doorframe of the workshop with a coffee in her hand and she'd say, "Halston, the man at the post office knows your name. You don't need to write him a letter every time you mail a package." And he would look up from whatever he was hand numbering in his ledger and he'd say, "Franny, the man at the post office is going to retire someday, and the next man might not know my name. So I write the letter." She named me Wrenley after her own mother. The first time I met him, I was 3 days old, and the family story is that he held me on his porch in his Carhartt jacket in the late October light, and he said to my mother, "This one is going to be quiet, like Franny's mother was quiet. She'll see things." He said it like a forecast. My mother repeated that story to me at least once a year until she had her stroke, and after that I told it back to her on her good days, and she would nod, and her eyes would water just at the edges. When I was 11 years old, I got pneumonia and missed 3 weeks of school. My grandfather drove down from the property every other afternoon for those 3 weeks, 90 minutes round trip, and he sat in the brown corduroy chair by my bed, and he read me Louis L'Amour westerns out loud. Hondo, Last of the Breed, the Sackett books. In his slow, careful voice. In his slow, careful voice. He did not skip the descriptive passages about land. He paused at every river crossing and every mountain pass, and he said, "You can see that, can't you, Wren?" And I would nod even when I had a fever of 103, because I could see it, because he could see it. When I was 15, my parents had a bad year financially. My father had been laid off from a sawmill in Prineville, and my mother was waitressing at a diner that closed without warning in March. I didn't know how bad it was at the time. What I knew was that one Saturday morning my grandfather drove into our driveway in his old Ford F-150, and he loaded my mother and me into the cab, and he drove us out to the property without saying where we were going. He parked at the gravel turnaround. He walked us to the lava rock at the northwest corner. He said, "Franny and I want you both to know something. This place was paid for in 1976, and there is no mortgage on it, and there will never be one. Whatever you are afraid of right now, it is not the worst thing. The worst thing is forgetting that you have somewhere to go." Then he handed each of us a butterscotch candy, and we walked back to the truck, and nobody said anything else about it. I think about that morning almost every week. I have thought about it more in the last 6 weeks than ever before in my life. My grandfather died in October of 2019. He was 81. He had a heart attack in his workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the same wooden stool he had sat on for 45 years, with his green ledger open in front of him and a brand new pencil sharpened to a point on the bench. My grandmother stayed in the house. They had built it together in 1974, and she kept his workshop locked because she said she couldn't bring herself to go in there yet. The key was on a brass hook by the back door, on a leather fob he'd made himself. It stayed on that hook for almost 5 years. My father, Hal's older son, died of a stroke in early 2022. My mother had passed 3 years before him. So by the time my grandmother went on hospice last spring, what was left of the Thatch family was my grandmother, my Uncle Devlin, and me. 3 people, 1 house, 7 acres backing up to BLM land that runs all the way to the high desert. You should know something about my Uncle Devlin before I keep going. Devlin Thatch is 58 years old. He sells commercial real estate in Redmond, the next town over, out of a little office above a sandwich shop. He drives a leased BMW that he washes every Saturday in his driveway, and he wears the same blue blazer to every family event, whether it's a wedding or a funeral. He is a man who calls women sweetheart, and who calls waiters chief, and who has, my entire life, treated me like a slightly slow child even after I got my master's in education at Western Oregon. When I was 9, he told me my hair was a brave color. When I was 16, he told me my college major was sweet but unrealistic. When I was 24 and got hired at Pine Ridge, he leaned over at Thanksgiving and said, "Kindergarten, huh? Well, somebody has to do it." And then he laughed at his own joke and reached for the gravy. I want to give you a few more examples, because one of them matters later, and I think you should see the pattern. When I was 19, I came home from college for spring break with a black eye. I had been hit in the face by an errant elbow during a recreational basketball game, and I had a perfectly good explanation. But Devlin came over for Easter dinner and he looked at me across the ham and he said, "Wren, sweetheart, you can tell us if there's a young man involved. We're family. Family is for hard conversations." I told him about the basketball game. He smiled, the salesman smile, and he said, "Of course, of course." And then for the rest of the meal, he kept finding little ways to mention how dangerous it is for young women to be too independent, how a girl who lives alone in a college town really ought to have an older male relative she can call. My grandfather did not look up from his plate the entire meal. After dessert, when Devlin had gone outside to make a phone call in his BMW, my grandfather walked past me in the kitchen, put a hand on my shoulder for 2 seconds, and said quietly, "He doesn't speak for any of us, kiddo." When I was 26, I bought my first house, a 1950s ranch on the east side of Bend, 1,800 square feet, a yard full of dandelions, and one mature ponderosa pine. I had saved for 4 years on a teacher's salary. I had cried in the parking lot of the title company after I signed. I had a small open house the next month, and Devlin came with Tessa, and Devlin walked through every room with the eye of a man appraising a property he was about to flip. He stood in my kitchen, and he tapped a knuckle on my counter, and he said, "These countertops are going to date this place inside of 10 years, Wren. You should have called me before you closed. I could have steered you to something with better resale." Tessa, to her credit, hissed his name under her breath. He didn't notice. He kept going. He told me my offer had probably been 10,000 too high, that the inspection had probably missed something, that I should keep his card on the fridge for when I needed to sell. I kept the card on the fridge. I never called. When my father died in 2022, Devlin gave the eulogy. My grandfather had asked me to give it, and I had spent 2 weeks writing it, and my grandmother had read it on a Sunday afternoon and squeezed my hand, and then on the morning of the funeral, Devlin pulled me aside in the church vestibule and said, "Wren, sweetheart, I'll handle the eulogy. You're going to be too emotional. Trust me. I do public speaking for a living." And before I could answer, he had walked up to the lectern with his own folded paper, and he had spoken for 11 minutes about my father, and the eulogy was about Devlin, about what Devlin had taught my father, about what Devlin had learned watching my father struggle. My grandfather sat in the front row the entire time, looking at the floor between his shoes. When it was over, my grandfather walked outside without speaking to him. I am giving you these examples because the pattern matters. Devlin did not hate me. Devlin did not have any particular feeling about me at all. Devlin saw me, my entire life, the same way he saw a piece of commercial real estate that hadn't been valued correctly yet. He was waiting for the right moment to come back with a low offer. The 7 acres were the offer. I was the slow seller he had been working for 31 years. My grandfather couldn't stand him. I knew this because of the silences. My grandfather was not a man who talked badly about his children. He was a man who fell silent in a particular way when Devlin walked in the room, the kind of silence that has a temperature, the kind that makes you stop chewing. I overheard them once. It was the summer my grandfather turned 78, the summer before he died. There was a family barbecue at the property, and I had walked around to the side of the house to find an extension cord, and I was on the gravel path between the house and the workshop when I heard their voices through the open kitchen window. I stopped because I heard my own name. Devlin said, "Dad, I'm just saying. The girl is a kindergarten teacher. She is not going to know what to do with 7 acres. There is no shame in being practical," my grandfather said in the quiet voice he used when he was at the very end of his patience. "Devlin, the girl walked the corner with me when she was 9. She knows where every pin is. She knows what to do with this land better than you ever will. We are not having this conversation again." Devlin said, "Dad, I'm trying to help." My grandfather said, "You were trying to help yourself." There was a long silence. Then I heard my grandfather's chair scrape back and his boots cross the kitchen floor, and the back door opened, and he walked out toward the workshop without seeing me on the gravel path. His face was set in a way I had only seen once or twice in my life. He walked past me without speaking. He went into the workshop and he closed the door. I stood there for about a minute. Then I went and got the extension cord from the side of the garage and I brought it back to the barbecue, and I did not say anything to anyone for the rest of the afternoon. That was the summer of 2018. The trust was filed in November of 2018. I did not put those two facts together until last month in Gilroy Munson's office with a bowl of butterscotch candies on the desk between us. Last spring, my grandmother went into hospice. She was 84 years old. She had stage 4 ovarian cancer and she was tired and she was lucid, maybe 40% of the time. The other 60%, she was somewhere between her own kitchen in 1969 and a dream where my grandfather was waiting on the porch. I drove out to her house every Tuesday and every Friday after school. I brought her chicken broth and old episodes of The Lawrence Welk Show on a portable DVD player. I held her hand. I read to her from the Reader's Digests she kept stacked on the side table. I noticed, after about 6 weeks, that someone else had been there. Devlin's truck tire prints in the gravel, a coffee cup in the kitchen sink that wasn't mine, a pen on the side table by Grandma's bed that wasn't hers, a heavy chrome pen with the logo of his real estate brokerage on the clip. Once, a manila folder on the kitchen counter, empty, stamped with the name of a Redmond title company. I didn't say anything. I watched. That's a habit I learned from my grandfather. The first time Devlin called me about the property was a Sunday night in May. I was on my couch grading sight word assessments. He opened with the voice he uses when he's about to ask for something. The warm one, the family one, the one that has a smile threaded through it. He said, "Wren, sweetheart, I've been thinking, once your grandma goes..." And I hate to be the one talking practical, I really do, but once she goes, that property is going to be a real headache for both of us. Property tax alone, my God. You've got that little teacher's salary, I've got my own mortgage, neither of us needs that kind of weight. I've been talking to a buyer and sisters. He'd take the whole parcel off our hands, quick, clean. We split it down the middle. You'd walk away with enough for a down payment on a real house in town. I let him talk. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said, I'd want to see anything in writing before I think about it, Uncle Dev. He laughed. He always laughed when I said something firm. He said, of course. I'll have my guy send something over. He never sent anything over. That was the first signal. People who are doing things straight send things over. People who are working an angle keep moving the conversation back to the phone. The second signal came 2 weeks later. My grandmother called me from the hospice landline. She was crying. Not loudly, just that thin, papery crying that old women do when they don't have the air for the big crying anymore. She said, "Wrenley, I think I signed something today. Devlin had a man here. They had a folder. I don't remember what they said. I'm sorry, honey, my head." I drove out there that night. Her hospice nurse, a woman named Pilar who had been with my grandmother for 2 months, met me at the door. Pilar is 47, originally from Nogales, and she does not put up with anything from anyone. She said, before I'd even taken my coat off, "Your uncle was here today with another man." They brought papers. I told them she was not in a state to sign anything legal. "Your uncle said it was just a family form." The other man called himself a notary. I am telling you what I saw, Miss Thatch, because I do not want to be on a witness stand someday wondering why I kept my mouth shut. I sat down at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same table I'd colored at when I was 4, and I felt something under my ribs go very still. I asked Pilar if she'd written it down. She said yes, in her shift log. Date, time, names, what was on the folder, what she observed about my grandmother's mental state. She had written that my grandmother had asked 3 times during the visit who the man with the folder was. She had written that my grandmother had signed something my uncle held in front of her without reading it. She had written that when Pilar tried to intervene, my uncle had said, "Don't worry about it, hun, we're family." Pilar said, "I am not your family's hon. I am her nurse." I asked Pilar if I could photograph the log entry. She said, "I was hoping you would ask." That was the night I went to the workshop. The brass key was still on the hook by the back door. I took it. I walked across the yard in my school clothes, a navy cardigan, gray slacks, the brown loafers I wear to staff meetings, and I unlocked the workshop door for the first time since my grandfather died. The smell hit me first. Sawdust and Old Spice and that cold mountain air that seems to live in old buildings even when the windows are closed. His bench was exactly the way he had left it. The plat map was still on the wall. His green ledger was on the shelf above the bench, leaning against a coffee can full of pencil stubs, and next to it was a USPS priority mailbox with my name written on the side in blue marker in his blocky surveyor's handwriting. W. Wrenley. If Devlin starts coming around. I sat down on the wooden stool he used to sit on. I cried for about 4 minutes. Then I pulled the box down and I opened it. Inside the box was a manila folder, a sealed white envelope, a smaller box of micro cassette tapes I didn't understand yet, and a sticky note on top that said, in the same blue marker, "Read the folder first. Save the envelope for last. Love, Grandpa." I read the folder first. Inside the folder was a copy of an irrevocable trust dated November 2018, prepared by a lawyer in Bend named Gilroy Munson, placing the entire 7-acre property, described in metes and bounds, every corner pin numbered, into a trust naming me, Wrenley Francis Thatch, as the sole beneficiary upon the death of the surviving grantor, my grandmother. Behind the trust was a notarized memorandum signed by my grandfather, explaining in plain language that he had created the trust because, and I am quoting, "My younger son Devlin has, in my judgment, demonstrated a pattern of financial decisions that make him an unsuitable steward of family land, and I do not wish for my granddaughter Wrenley, who has loved this place since she was a child, to be required to fight him for it after I am gone." Behind the memorandum was a small slip of paper with a name and a phone number. Gilroy Munson, attorney at law, Bend, Oregon. And underneath, in my grandfather's handwriting, "Call him. He has the originals. He's expecting you." Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. I called Gilroy Munson the next morning before school. Gilroy Munson turned out to be 71 years old, semi-retired, working 3 days a week out of an office on Greenwood Avenue above a yarn store. He still typed his correspondence on an IBM Selectric. There was a bowl of butterscotch candies on his desk. When I walked in for our first appointment, he looked up over a pair of half-moon reading glasses and he said, "You have his eyes." He told me you would. His office smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. There was a plate of saltine crackers on the side table for an office cat that had died 2 years earlier and which he had not gotten around to replacing. The carpet was the color of weak tea. On the wall behind his desk was a framed certificate from the Oregon State Bar dated 1979 and a black and white photograph of 2 young men in fishing waders standing in a river. The man on the left was a young version of Gilroy. The man on the right was my grandfather. I asked him about the photograph. He looked over his shoulder at it, smiled, and said, "Lower Deschutes, summer of 1981. Your grandfather hooked a 13-pound rainbow trout that day, and I never heard the end of it for 40 years. He was my client, and he was my friend, and the line between those two things blurred a long time ago. He had everything. The original signed trust. A power of attorney my grandmother had executed in 2018, while she was still entirely sound of mind, naming me, not Devlin, as her financial agent in the event of incapacity. A signed and witnessed letter from my grandmother, written in her own beautiful old-fashioned cursive, stating that any document presented to her after her cancer diagnosis should not be considered an expression of her wishes, and that she had pre-authorized me to challenge any such document. And a typed page from my grandfather, hand-signed, dated October 2018, that began with the line, "If you are reading this, my son has done what I was afraid he would do." Gilroy slid each document across the desk to me, one at a time, and he explained each one in the slow voice of a man who has explained complicated things to scared people for 45 years. He explained metes and bounds. He explained what an irrevocable trust does and does not do. He explained why the power of attorney mattered and why my grandmother's pre-authorized challenge mattered even more. He explained what a Leah pendens was and why it was the single most important piece of paper we were going to file. Gilroy folded his hands. He said, "Your grandfather sat in the chair you're sitting in for 2.5 hours that morning. He cried twice. He apologized to me for taking up so much of my time. And then he said the most important thing a client has ever said to me, which was, 'My granddaughter is going to walk in here someday, scared and angry, and I want her to walk back out steady.' He paid for the steady, Ms. Thatch. That part is already covered. I asked him what to do. He said, 'We file a lee s pendens, today, right now. It's a notice of pending legal action that gets recorded against the property. Any title transfer your uncle attempts after this is recorded will be flagged at the recording window. The clerk will not record it. He will hand it back to whoever brings it in.' I said, 'He has a lawyer. He'll fight it.'" Gilroy smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been doing this since 1979. He said, "Miss Thatch, your uncle's lawyer will fight a lease pendens for about 90 seconds, and then he will read the trust I'm holding in this folder, and then he will tell your uncle to sit down and shut up. There is nothing to fight. There is only the question of whether your uncle understands that yet, or whether he has to learn it standing at a counter window in front of strangers." I asked him how my grandfather had known, how a man in 2018 had predicted, with this much precision, what his own son would try to do 6 years later. Gilroy looked at the photograph on the wall for a long second. Then he looked back at me. He said, "Your grandfather knew because Devlin had already done it once before, on a smaller scale, with a piece of equipment your grandfather had loaned him for a job. Sold it without asking. Pocketed the money. Told the family it had been stolen. Your grandfather never said a word to anybody but me because he didn't want to break your grandmother's heart over a piece of equipment. But he wrote it down, Miss Thatch. He wrote everything down. That was the year he came in and he said, 'Gilroy, I want to build something my son can't break. Take as long as you need. Charge me what it costs.' He paid me in full, in person, with a personal check in October of 2018. The check cleared on a Wednesday. He died 11 months later. He never asked me about any of it again. He trusted me to be here when you walked in. I sat in that chair for a long time. Gilroy poured me a glass of water from a pitcher on his desk, and he did not say anything else. The IBM Selectric hummed softly in the corner. Outside the window, somebody was walking a small white dog past the yarn store. He filed the lease pendens that afternoon. Single-page notice, cream-colored paper, red ink stamp at the top, recorded against tax lot 171223 DC 040 Viewer in the Deschutes County record system. Public. Permanent. Visible to any clerk who pulled up that property number on a screen. That was 21 days before my uncle walked into the courthouse. In the meantime, my grandmother died. She passed on a Wednesday morning in late September in her own bed, with Pilar holding her left hand and me holding her right. Outside the window, the aspen by the driveway had just started to turn. The light through the curtains was that soft, watery gold that only happens in Central Oregon in late September. She squeezed my fingers once at the very end. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Pilar made me a cup of tea, and we sat at the kitchen table and we waited for the funeral home. Pilar said, "Your grandfather was a careful man. I never met him, but I can tell." I said, "How can you tell?" She said, "Because she's leaving the way he left, without a single thing left undone." The funeral was on a Saturday. Devlin showed up in his blue blazer with his wife Tessa, who had been crying in the parking lot before the service. He hugged me at the back of the chapel and he whispered, "Wren, sweetheart, I know this isn't the time, but we should sit down next week. There's some practical things to handle, property and so forth." I said, "Sure, Uncle Dev." He smiled at me the way he always had, like I was a slightly slow child, like he had a buyer lined up in Sisters and a closing date on the calendar, and a plan he had been running for 6 months. He had no idea that 21 days earlier on a Tuesday afternoon, I had walked into the Deschutes County Clerk's office at 3 in the afternoon, signed Gilroy Munson's Lee pendens at the recording window, and shaken hands with a 62-year-old woman behind the counter who looked at me, looked at my last name on the form, and said, "Wrenley Thatch? Lord have mercy." I had you in Sunday school the year you lost your front tooth. Her name is Marguerite Vendel. She had taught Sunday school with my mother at First Presbyterian for 15 years before my mother's stroke. She had baked the casseroles that came to our house for 2 months after my mother died. She kept a framed photo of the Sunday school class of 2003 on her desk at the courthouse, and I was in the front row of that photo, gap-toothed, holding a paper crown. Marguerite had recorded my lease pendants herself. She had stamped it. She had filed it in the system under tax lot 171223 DC DC 0040 Dread. She had said to me on her way to lunch, "Honey, if anyone, and I mean anyone, comes to this window with a deed for that parcel, I will know about it before they finish writing the date." You understand me? I understood her. The morning Devlin walked into the courthouse was a Tuesday, cold for October. There was frost on the windshields in the parking lot. I was at school by 7:30, doing morning circle with 22 5-year-olds, when my phone vibrated in my desk drawer. I didn't look at it until snack time. It was a text from Marguerite. 3 words. He just walked in. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't ask me what to do. She just told me he was in the building. Because she had said she would. I asked the front office to cover my class for 15 minutes. I drove the 4 blocks to the courthouse with my hands very steady on the wheel as my Subaru. I parked in the lot behind the old library. I walked up the marble steps to the second floor. I came in through the side door of the recording office, and I stood at the back, behind a column, where I could see the counter window without being seen myself. Have you ever set a boundary and watched someone completely unravel because you stopped being convenient? Have you ever watched it happen at a counter window in a county building, with fluorescent lights humming and a stranger's coffee cup on the floor by their foot? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Devlin was at the window. He had his blue blazer on. He had a leather portfolio under his arm. He had the quitclaim deed laid out in front of him on the counter, freshly notarized, the ink still slightly raised on the page. There was a younger man with him in a charcoal suit. His lawyer, a man named Orrin Fielding, who had a downtown office and a reputation in Bend for being faster than he was careful. Marguerite was at the recording window, reading glasses on a beaded chain, cardigan over her shoulders, hands folded calmly on the counter. Devlin slid the deed across the counter. He said in his sandwich shop voice, "Recording, please. Tax lot 171223 DC 100 400. There you go. Just a family transfer." Marguerite picked up the deed. She did not look down at it. She typed the parcel number into her computer. She watched her screen for about 3 seconds. Her face did not change. Then she slid the deed back across the counter, calmly, with 2 fingers, the way you slide a bill back to a customer who has handed you the wrong amount. She said, "I can't record this, sir." Devlin blinked. He said, "I'm sorry?" She said, "There is a law pendens on this parcel, filed 3 weeks ago. Any attempted title transfer is on hold pending review. You'll want to take this back to your attorney." Orrin Fielding stepped up. Orrin Fielding said in the brisk voice of a man who has not yet read the file, "There must be some mistake. This is a clean transfer. The grantor signed a power of attorney." Marguerite turned her screen around. She said, "Sir, the grantor is deceased as of last Wednesday. The power of attorney you're referring to is being challenged in the document on my screen, which was filed by counsel of record. I am not going to record this deed today. If you have an issue with that, the records director's office is down the hall." There was a man behind Devlin in line. He was holding his own paperwork. He was an older man, maybe 70, in a Carhartt jacket not unlike my grandfather's. He had been listening. He looked at the deed on the counter. He looked at the parcel number on the screen. He said, mostly to himself, but loud enough that everyone heard, "Wait a minute, isn't that the Thatch place? Out by the BLM line?" Marguerite said quietly, "Yes, sir, it is." The older man looked at Devlin for a long second. Then he stepped back in line and pretended to read his own paperwork, the way polite small-town people do when they have just witnessed something they will absolutely be telling their wife about over dinner. Devlin's face changed. I want to describe this carefully because it matters. He did not get angry. He did not get loud. Something behind his expression simply shifted, like a window blind dropping 1 notch. The salesman's smile stayed on his face. The salesman's warmth left his eyes. He looked at the deed on the counter, and he looked at Marguerite, and he said, very quietly, "Who filed the lee pendens?" Marguerite turned her screen back around. She said, "I'm not at liberty to discuss filings outside the document itself, sir. The document is public record. You can request a copy at the next window." She did not say my name, but Devlin's eyes flicked, just for half a second, past Marguerite's shoulder and toward the back of the room, where I happened to be standing behind the column with my arms folded. Our eyes met. Just once. And in that look, I watched my uncle realize in real time that the slightly slow child he had been talking to for 31 years had walked into this building 3 weeks before he had signed a single piece of paper and closed every door he had spent 6 months prying open. He didn't say anything to me. He gathered his deed off the counter. His hands were shaking very slightly. Orrin Fielding tried to ask another question, and Marguerite told him, politely, that the line was building up and they needed to move along. Devlin walked past me on his way out. He didn't look at me. He smelled like the cologne he wears to closings, something woody and expensive and slightly desperate. The leather portfolio was tucked under his arm. The salesman's smile was still on his face when he hit the marble hallway. I think he kept it on all the way to his BMW. I think that was the worst part for him, having to keep walking. I went back to school. I did Letter of the Week with my class. The letter was R. We made paper rabbits with cotton balls for tails. One of my students, a little girl named Posy with 2 missing front teeth, told me my hair looked nice today. I thanked her. I did not cry until I was in my car at 3:30 in the parking lot, and even then it was only for about a minute, and the crying was not for what had happened, but for the fact that my grandfather had known, 6 years ago, sitting in Gilroy Munson's office with a bowl of butterscotch candies in front of him, that this exact morning was going to come. The cascade started the next afternoon. Marguerite, at her own discretion as a senior recording clerk and a citizen of the state of Oregon, referred Orrin Fielding's notarized power of attorney to the Oregon State Bar's Client Assistance Office. She also referred the matter to the Deschutes County Sheriff's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit, citing ORS 1411111, the Oregon statute that specifically addresses financial abuse of vulnerable persons. She did not consult me before doing this. She did not need to. The power of attorney had been notarized by a man whose commission, it turned out, had expired 4 months earlier, a fact that Orrin Fielding had either missed or chosen not to look at, and either way, it was now on the desk of an investigator in Salem. Orrin Fielding's law license was suspended pending investigation within 9 days. His firm in Bend dropped him within 3 weeks. His name was quietly removed from the directory of the Central Oregon Bar Association. A deputy from the sheriff's office served Devlin at his house on a Thursday evening at 5:20, just as he was pulling into the driveway in his BMW. 2 of his neighbors saw the cruiser. By Sunday, 3 of them had texted Tessa. By Monday, Tessa had moved to her sister's house in Prineville. By the end of the 2nd week, she had filed for divorce, citing, and I learned this from a cousin who works at the Crook County Courthouse, irreconcilable differences and discovery of significant undisclosed financial misconduct. Devlin's commercial real estate brokerage license was suspended pending the criminal case. The sandwich shop office in Redmond was emptied within a month. A handwritten sign on the door said, "Closed indefinitely." The Central Oregon Builders Association removed his name from the directory. His golf membership at the club lapsed. The leased BMW was returned to the dealership in Bend on a flatbed, because by then Devlin no longer trusted himself to drive it past the courthouse without something happening to it. He called me twice. The first call was a Sunday night. He left a voicemail. He said, "Wren, sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're family. Can we sit down? Just you and me. No lawyers." The second call was a Tuesday afternoon. He left another voicemail. He said, "Wren, honey, I know you're angry, but you have to understand your grandfather didn't think clearly at the end. None of us did. We loved him. We loved her. There are 2 sides to every story. Please call me back." I didn't call him back. Tessa called me too, 3 weeks after the courthouse. She did not leave a voicemail. She called 4 times in one Saturday afternoon, and on the fifth call, I picked up because I was going to lose my mind otherwise. She was crying. She said, "Wren, I am so sorry. I want you to know I am so sorry." I had no idea. He told me your grandmother had asked him to handle the property. He told me everyone in the family had agreed. I believed him for years, Wren. I believed every word out of his mouth for 22 years. I'm sitting in my sister's kitchen in Prineville, and I'm trying to figure out how I missed it. I told her, gently, that she didn't owe me an apology. That if anyone in the family owed an apology, it wasn't her. She cried harder. She said, "I should have known. I should have known the day he told me your grandfather was confused at the end. Your grandfather was the most clear-headed man I ever met. We talked for about 40 minutes. We did not talk about the property. We talked about my grandmother's cinnamon rolls and about a Christmas when my grandfather had carved a wooden duck for Tessa's daughter from his first marriage. By the end of the call, Tessa said, "I'm going to send you something next week. A small thing. Something I think your grandmother would have wanted you to have." She mailed me a flat box 4 days later, and inside it was a Pyrex casserole dish from my grandmother's wedding shower in 1962, robin's egg blue, the gold trim still mostly intact, the lid wrapped separately in newspaper. Tessa had written on a card, "She wanted you to have this. He told me she wanted me to have it. I know better now. I'm sorry it took me this long." I keep that Pyrex on the shelf above my stove. I have not used it yet. I don't know when I will. Two of Devlin's friends from the Central Oregon Builders Association showed up at the courthouse on the morning of his arraignment. One of them was a man named Clyde Beasley, who had known my father in high school. After the hearing, Clyde drove out to Bend, and he came to my classroom at the end of the school day while I was packing up sight word flashcards into a Ziploc bag. He stood in the doorway in his work boots, holding his cap in his hands, and he said, "Wrenley, I want you to know something. Your dad and I roomed together our senior year of high school on a baseball trip to Klamath Falls. He spent the whole bus ride home telling me about how his little girl was the smartest kid in her grade. You were maybe 4 years old. He said you were going to be the one who held the family together. He was right." Clyde Beasley took a long breath. He said, "I'm sorry I sat in that man's office and shook his hand for 15 years. I should have been able to see it. I told him that nobody can see something they aren't looking for, and that he was a kind man for driving all the way out, and I gave him a hug in the hallway because that is what my father would have wanted me to do. I'm going to tell you something honestly, because I owe you that." I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel righteous. I sat at my kitchen table the night after the courthouse, with a mug of black coffee going cold in my hands and my Timex watch ticking on my wrist, and what I felt was tired, bone-deep tired. Cleansed in some quiet way I can't explain. Free of a thing I hadn't realized I was carrying until I set it down. I drove out to the property the following Saturday, by myself. I parked in the gravel turnaround. I walked the corner walk, the one my grandfather had taken me on when I was 9 years old. Southeast pin, northeast pin, north line, all the way to the BLM fence. Northwest corner, where the flat lava rock the size of a card table is still sitting exactly where it has sat for 10,000 years. I sat down on it. I unwrapped a butterscotch candy from the bowl on Gilroy Munson's desk, the one he had pressed into my hand as I left his office that afternoon, and I put it in my mouth. I read the last thing in my grandfather's USPS priority mailbox. The sealed white envelope, the one the sticky note had told me to save for last. Inside, it was a single piece of paper. My grandfather's blocky surveyor's handwriting. 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said, "Wrenley, if you are reading this on the rock, you already know everything you needed to know. The land remembers you. The papers are at Gilroy's. The rest is up to you." The second paragraph said, "I never knew how to tell you in person how proud I was of you. You were always the steadiest one of us. I'm sorry your father passed before he could tell you that himself. Some men are good at saying things, and some men are good at writing them down, and I figured out which kind I was about 30 years too late. So I wrote it down. Build the life you want on this land. Or don't. Sell it if you need to. Live on it if you want to. Just know it's yours, and it was always going to be yours because you are the one who walked it. Love, Grandpa? I sat on that rock for a long time. The light in October out by the BLM line is a particular kind of gold that doesn't look real. The wind came down off the mountains the way it always does at 4 in the afternoon. A pair of scrub jays argued in a juniper 20 feet away. I held the piece of paper in my hands, and I let the wind dry the edges of it, and I understood, finally, what he had meant when I was 9 years old. Land remembers who walked it. Paper just helps it remember out loud. I'm going to tell you something I have learned in the last 6 weeks, because I have been turning it over every night and I think it is the most honest thing I know how to say. Peace doesn't come from winning, it comes from standing on something solid and knowing somebody put it there for you on purpose. Real love doesn't test you to prove you deserve it. Real love builds the structure first and waits for you to find it. Sometimes the people who protect you aren't the people standing in front of you. Sometimes they planned for you years ago, in offices smelling of ink and butterscotch candies, with men in brown loafers typing on machines older than you are. If you could protect one thing in your life, a place, a person, a promise, what would it be? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I read them slowly, with a cup of coffee, the way you read a letter that traveled a long way. I tell one of these every night. Some nights I sit at my kitchen table with the lights low, and I wonder if anyone out there is really listening. Then I scroll through the comments from Mobile and Sacramento and Spokane and Greenfield and Marion, and I remember that you are. There's another one waiting for tomorrow night. There's no shortage of these stories, which is the saddest part of all of this. But I will be back here tomorrow night. I always am. If this one stayed with you, the story on your screen now is for you. A girl whose stepmother charged her rent to live in her own inherited house, until one sealed envelope at the bank changed everything. Tap the card. I'll see you there.